The subcommittee hearing will come to order. Before I begin my remarks, I would like to convey our deepest condolences to our former colleague, congressional colleague, Lincoln Diaz-Balart, who lost his son this week. Chairman Ros-Lehtinen could not be here this afternoon because she is attending the funeral services in Miami. Our thoughts and prayers are with his family, and I would like to observe a moment of silence, please. Thank you. After recognizing myself and Ranking Member Deutsch for 5 minutes each for our opening statements, we will then hear from our witnesses, and without objection, the witnesses' prepared statements will be made part of the record, and members may have 5 days to insert statements and questions for the record, subject to the length and limitations in the rules. In addition, without objection, Chairman Ros-Lehtinen's statement and questions will be included for the record. The Vice Chair now recognizes himself for 5 minutes. In this era of new challenges, political tensions, and the ever-present potential for conflict, it is vitally important that the United States remain a global leader in promoting democracy, ensuring regional stability, and providing humanitarian assistance abroad. However, the United States must balance these priorities with its responsibility to be wise stewards of hard-earned taxpayer dollars. We must ensure that every dollar of foreign aid is spent effectively and with the goal of promoting the interest and goals of the United States. I am concerned by the lack of oversight and transparency that exist in many State Department and USAID programs. I am also troubled by the seemingly lack of a clear and cohesive foreign policy agenda under this administration. This region is facing significant challenges, from the Arab Spring to Iran's nuclear proliferation to the raging conflict in Syria. I hope today's hearing will provide clarity and certainty to the question of how the administration is using taxpayer dollars to promote our national interest in the midst of these political and regional upheavals. I am pleased that the assistance to Israel remains a key component of the fiscal FY14 budget. The importance that Israel plays in ensuring regional stability cannot be overstated. Amidst the challenges this area of the world is facing, now is the time to help Israel preserve its qualitative military edge. To that end, I recently introduced House Resolution 1992. This legislation would increase the QME reporting frequency and ensure the President considers cyber and asymmetric attacks in this evaluation. At this time, I'd like to recognize the Ranking Member, Mr. Deutsch, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Assistant Secretary Jones, Assistant Administrator Romanowski, thanks for being here today. I couldn't imagine a more timely hearing for this subcommittee as we continue to face serious challenges in this volatile region and grapple with how to adequately address them from a U.S. policy perspective. The FY 2014 budget request for Near East is $7.36 billion. And I'd like to point out, as I have done routinely in this committee, the entire international affairs budget makes up only 1% of the total budget. We must ensure, however, that these dollars are being used in the most effective and efficient manner possible. I'd like to take a moment and commend the humanitarian work that State and USAID are doing in Syria. As we struggle with the appropriate role for the U.S. in Syria, we cannot ignore the need for an immediate response to humanitarian crises. As the violence in Syria threatens to spill over into Jordan and Lebanon, we must examine the destabilizing effect that spillover could have on the region. Lebanon is sheltering 400,000 Syrian refugees, while Hezbollah's engagement in Syria has emboldened its threats against Israel. I'm very pleased to see that this year's assistance to Israel remains intact, as Israel faces threats from Hezbollah and Hamas and the existential threat of a nuclear-armed Iran. We must ensure that our ally can defend herself and our interests in the region. The over 500,000 Syrian refugees inside Jordan are compounding its already vulnerable economic situation. Jordan's a linchpin for the region. The collapse of Jordan would have serious implications for the security of Israel and for Gulf cooperation. Under Jordan's auspices, U.S.-led security training helps to ensure stability in the West Bank. In addition to the FY 2014 ESF and FMF requests, President Obama has announced $200 million for humanitarian relief in Jordan. We must continue to support our crucial ally. With respect to Egypt, I understand the concern among some as to why the U.S. continues to provide aid given some of the actions of the Morsi government over the past year. I support our continued relationship with the Egyptian military, but those cannot be the only ties between our countries. We cannot ignore the human rights abuses, the repression of women and religious minorities, and the refusal of the Morsi government to engage in an inclusive political process. The newly proposed law restricting NGO operations is particularly concerning, and it poses a great threat to U.S. aid partners working to strengthen civil society. We cannot help rebuild a democratic Egypt simply by providing tanks and fighter jets. We must help support good governance, an independent judiciary, and greater civic participation. As we normalize our support role in Iraq and scale down our assistance by over 50%, we must encourage an inclusive political system in Iraq where a growing sectarian divide threatens to push the country into chaos. In Iran, as we continue to pursue all options for preventing the regime from obtaining nuclear weapons capabilities, we must find ways to engage the Iranian people who deserve to live in a free and democratic society. I'm extremely disheartened by yesterday's disqualification of former President Rafsanjani and the immediate steps the regime took to repress its own people and freedom of expression. This unfortunately all but assures that the upcoming presidential elections will again not reflect the true will of the Iranian people. In short, I believe the U.S. needs to be able to react and respond with flexibility to challenges in the region. The $580 million requested for the Middle East and North Africa Incentive Fund is designed to give us that flexibility. And I hope that our witnesses will be able to give us a greater sense today of how they envision that fund being used and ensure that we are not duplicating the efforts of the Middle East Partnership Initiative or other transition funds. Secretary Jones, Administrator Romanowski, as you are well aware, 5 minutes is simply not enough time to address the challenges we face in the region, from rebuilding an economically stable Tunisia to strengthening the rule of law in Libya to investing in human capital in Yemen. Each country has its own complex set of challenges and issues, and each one requires a different policy approach. I look forward to a productive discussion with you today, and I yield back.
I appreciate the ranking member's statement. I appreciate also the witnesses being here today, and I look forward to hearing from them. I would now like to introduce them. First, Ambassador Beth Jones is the Acting Assistant Secretary of State for the Near East. Prior to this, she served as the Deputy Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan, and as the Assistant Secretary of State for Europe and Eurasia under Secretary Powell. Having served as a Foreign Service officer for 35 years with postings in Kabul, Cairo, Amman, Baghdad, and Berlin, Ambassador Jones has held numerous senior positions at the Department of State. Our second witness, Ms. Ileana Romanowski, is the Acting Assistant Administrator at USAID's Bureau for the Middle East. Prior to that, Ms. Romanowski has had a long and distinguished career in government service, having previously held numerous senior positions in the State and Defense Departments involving the Near East and South Asia. She is also the recipient of numerous awards for her public service, including the Presidential Distinguished Rank Award for Senior Executive Service. Ambassador Jones, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Chairman Collins, Ranking Member Deutsch, distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you very much for inviting me and Acting Assistant Administrator Romanowski to appear before you today to discuss our FY 2014 budget request. The Middle East and North Africa continue to experience tectonic political, social, and economic changes. We are on the precipice of a possibly dangerous transformation that could last for generations. The tension between democratic values of human rights, tolerance and pluralism, and threats to those principles, including extremism and persecution of minorities, is growing. These dynamics present new challenges and opportunities for U.S. engagement. We must be equipped to capitalize on these opportunities to ensure that our interests, goals, and values are secure. Although the region has undergone monumental changes in the past 2 years, our fundamental interests remain the same: to protect Israel's security and advance Middle East peace, to curtail Iran's destabilizing influence in the region and ensure that it upholds its international obligations, and to work with those in the region who are yearning for dignity, opportunity, and a role in determining their future. We are refocusing our engagement so that they can achieve those fundamental objectives within the new reality. And we are responding to crises that threaten our interests and the security of the region, and supporting the Syrian people as they continue to suffer under a brutal regime. We will continue to support, protect, and defend our diplomats, development professionals, and our facilities as we pursue our objectives. This is not easy. The transitions underway are the foreign policy challenge of our time. New leaders face tremendous challenges in responding to their citizens' raised expectations as they learn the ropes of new participatory and constitutional processes and grapple with serious security challenges. Our budget request reflects what we know to be true. To advance and protect our interests, we must engage in the region. We must be a partner and a positive influence, seeking to ensure that what emerges from these transitions are pluralistic, prosperous, durable countries that can be partners in the pursuit of shared interests. Our request is for $7.36 billion, and a request for NEA state operations funding is $1.15 billion. As we continue to face a constrained budget environment at home, this request reflects our critical national security interests and enduring commitments. Ensuring Israel's security and achieving a negotiated solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict are at the core of our interests. Our request for military assistance to Israel is for the full amount of our MOU and reflects our unshakable commitment to Israel's security as it faces significant threats. Our assistance to the Palestinian people is aimed at building a capable Palestinian partner government committed to peace and a two-state solution, supporting the development of security and law enforcement professionals, local governance systems, and economic reform contributes to overall stability. As of 2011, terror attacks have dropped 96% since the previous 5 years. Our military assistance to Egypt underpins the peace treaty between Israel and Egypt and promotes key U.S. security interests. Economic, governance, and security assistance will support the Egyptian people and encourage their government to follow the path of reform. The largest increase from our FY 2012 request is our request for $580 million to create the Middle East and North Africa Incentive Fund. This account would provide resources commensurate with emerging and evolving challenges and opportunities. It will be used to promote political, institutional, economic, and security sector reform. This new funding is offset by significantly reduced assistance for Iraq, where we are encouraging the government to fund its own security and to provide for the needs of its citizens. Finally, we must be ready in FY 2014 for the transition in Syria to a post-Assad government deserving of our support. Transition in Syria holds the potential to weaken Iranian influence throughout the region and to remove a key state sponsor of terrorism, enhancing regional stability. We will need to invest new resources to shape this strategic transformation. When the Berlin Wall came down in 1989, we responded significantly to that opportunity, making available billions to support transitions to democracy. We see these challenges in the Middle East through the same lens. We are responding with strategic investments and new strategies that reflect the critical need to engage, despite the tremendous physical constraints we face here at home. I thank the subcommittee for holding this hearing, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Ambassador, thank you so much. Now, Ms. Romanowski.
Chairman Collins, Ranking Member Deutsch, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to discuss USAID's FY 2014 budget request. USAID's assistance is an effective instrument in the long-term security and prosperity of this critically important and rapidly evolving region. It is an investment in our own economic health and national security. Over the last 30 years that I've worked on the Middle East, I've learned that democratic transitions take time. It's a messy process. But 2 years after the Arab Spring, the common desire for dignity, opportunity, and self-determination that originally spurred people to action continued to drive these transitions across the region. USAID is requesting $1.2 billion to continue to support people as they write new constitutions, as they carry out free and fair elections, and as they advocate for increased participation in their country's politics and economic growth. We are focused on making smart and sustainable investments in a difficult budget environment. Our request reflects our commitment to helping governments be more responsive to the needs of their people by supporting democratic reform, inclusive economic growth, a thriving civil society, and addressing the needs of vulnerable populations, including women and youth. I'd like to give you a snapshot of some of the work USAID has been doing in support of these transitions, beginning with the crisis in Syria and its impact on the region. There are now 1.5 million Syrian refugees in neighboring countries, while inside Syria, an additional 6.8 million people are in dire need of humanitarian assistance. We are providing nearly $514 million in humanitarian assistance. We're also committing $250 million in civilian transition assistance to the Syrian coalition in support of local leaders who are trying to lay the groundwork for a stable and democratic future. The increasing refugee influx into Jordan and Lebanon is severely straining their resources, and our FY14 request will allow USAID to help host communities cope with this strain. Egypt remains a critical priority for regional stability and Middle East peace. We are making smart investments by responding to citizens' demands for better education, jobs, and rights. We will also further capitalize the Egyptian American Enterprise Fund to continue to promote small and medium enterprises. And to address the aspiration of Egypt's young people, we are launching the new U.S.-Egypt Higher Education Initiative. Through scholarships, university partnerships, and private sector engagement, we will provide thousands of young Egyptians opportunities to build skills that will lead to jobs in key fields needed for today's global economy. Turning to Tunisia, we will continue to support the political transition process through programs in economic and political reform, workforce development, open and transparent governance, and private sector investment and growth, such as the Tunisian American Enterprise Fund. Yemen faces some of the biggest challenges, including dire humanitarian conditions. Yet despite these obstacles, the country is progressing under an inclusive national dialogue, which will lead to a constitutional review and culminate in national elections early next year. Our request will assist the transition by supporting constitutional review, elections, and voter registry reform, and will allow us to improve health services and access to quality basic education, especially for girls. Our critical work in the West Bank and Gaza will continue to provide the foundation for a negotiated and sustained two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Our request will continue to support Palestinian institution building by providing assistance in the areas of democracy and governance, education, health, and water resources, as well as direct budget support to the Palestinian Authority. Finally, on Iraq, like other U.S. government agencies, USAID is reducing our programs and presence. As such, we have not requested funding in FY14. Existing funds will continue programs that support vulnerable populations, strengthen civil society, improve governing institutions, and promote private sector development. In conclusion, I am confident that the President's FY14 budget request sustains the foundation for USAID to partner with and positively influence these countries to address the challenges and advance the changes we have begun to see in this critically important region. I appreciate the opportunity to appear before you today, and I'm happy to answer your questions. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate both of you being here, and now I will recognize myself for 5 minutes of questions. Since 1979, Egypt has been the second largest recipient of U.S. Foreign assistance. Currently, Egypt receives $1.3 billion annually through the foreign military financing. State Department is requesting an additional $250 million for fiscal year 14 for economic growth and political reform. In addition, Egypt is receiving $4.1 million in international narcotics and law enforcement monies, funds for a total of $1.6 billion this year. This does not include additional funds Egypt could receive through international funds as well. What conditions has the State Department put on the foreign assistance to the Egyptian government at this time?
We have an important strategic relationship with Egypt, given its position in the Middle East and given its partnership with Israel in supporting the Egypt-Israel peace treaty. That's a fundamental of our relationship with Egypt. And we've been pleased to see how much President Morsi has worked to assure the maintenance of that peace treaty, peace in Gaza, and has worked, he and his military have worked well with Israel to maintain the ceasefire in Gaza that President Morsi helped to negotiate. All of the FMF, the foreign military financing that we provide to the Egyptian military, to Egypt through the Egyptian military, we think furthers those goals. It allows us to work with the Egyptian military in ways that demonstrate that they share our strategic goals for Egypt and for the region. The Egyptian military provides us considerable benefits, including overflight access, privileged access through the Suez Canal, counter-terrorist cooperation, access to the U.S. military, and we're increasingly working with the Egyptian military and with the Egyptian government on border controls and counter-terrorist operations. The additional assistance that we provide Egypt is to support Egypt's transition to a democratic government, to a democratic society. It's a long transition. It's a difficult transition. When you think how far Egypt has come since Tahrir Square, it's an impressive transition so far, but there's still a long way to go. The work that we do with the Egyptian government and with civil society is focused on building those democratic transitions, and at the same time the assistance gives us a chance to talk in quite a bit of detail with the Egyptian government, various elements of the Egyptian government, about the importance of maintaining democratic institutions, about the importance of there being an NGO law that comports and complies with international principles and international standards. It allows us to talk in quite a bit of detail about the importance of religious freedom issues, protection of minorities, protection of women, and the kinds of things that we think are important in terms of U.S. Values. Nothing that we do with Egypt is automatic. We are able to keep a string on anything that we may provide, so that we can be certain that the assistance that we provide to Egypt is being used in the way it's meant to be used, and so that we can continue to maintain the dialogue that we need to, both with the Egyptian government, with the opposition, and with the Egyptian civil society.
Okay, Ambassador, I appreciate that. I think the concern you have here is the Egyptian military and their working relationship. We understand. I think there's a concern, and we may get to this in a little bit, with the Morsi government itself being stable enough in the region. The reason I ask what conditions we have here is because the human rights organizations have stated that President Morsi has jailed, in his first 200 days in office, he had jailed more Egyptian citizens under the charge of insulting the president than even President Mubarak had. We still have claims with the Muslim Brotherhood, who is growing in influence, who's yet to recognize even the existence or Israel's right to exist. These are the kind of things that concern me, and they're concerns. And we've heard a lot about a Syrian red line or anything. Is there a red line with Egypt? Is there a red line to say what Morsi's dismissing of the Constitution, mass incarcerations, not protecting liberties? Where is the line that we deal with Egypt in this?
As I said in my opening remarks, engagement, we think, is the absolute critical part of the work that we do in Egypt with the Morsi government, and with civil society there. We have lost not a single opportunity to speak with President Morsi and with his senior officials about the importance that we attach to speaking out against the judiciary when it undertakes the kinds of arrests that you've talked about. Those we find unacceptable. We've asked very recently, even as recently as yesterday, we've called on the Egyptian government to speak out against those, that those are not the measure of a democratic government. They are not the measure of the new democratic society that people fought for in Tahrir Square. We have lost not a single opportunity to speak to Morsi about President Morsi about the importance of maintaining religious freedom, about the importance of protecting the Coptic Christians, of the importance of protecting women, so that we can, and we have used these opportunities to underscore how we can use our assistance programs to enhance the ability of his government and civil society to work together to develop the democratic institutions that the Egyptian people fought for in Tahrir Square.
Well, Ambassador, I appreciate the openness and the dialogue. My concern is, and my time is up and I'm going to move on, but my concern is that the dialogue being open, that is always going to be open in the sense that we can always talk about it. The question is where, and maybe we'll get to it later, is when does the talk sort of end? When do we, after not seeing any results, when are we going to draw the red line there? And we'll come to that, but my time has ended. I want to now recognize the ranking member for his line of question.
Thank you, Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to pick up with where the full committee left off a little while ago, which is Iran. And in particular, the news of the past day and a half or so about the upcoming elections, the steps that the regime has taken to prevent transmission of information, the limitation on the number of candidates and who those candidates are. And I'd start by going back to the crackdown on the protests in 2009 after the elections. And I'd ask what's being done to prepare for different election outcomes, including the possible protests, the potential election of a reformist, which seems to have been lost based on the slate that was approved, or any potential conflict between Ahmadinejad and the supreme leader. That's the first question. And then the second, I think, flows from that. That's a question of human rights in Iran. Iran continues to be one of the most egregious human rights violators in the world, particularly as it relates to freedom of expression, which again, as I pointed out, and as the Press Council pointed out, that repression has heightened dramatically just in the past couple of days. Ahead of the elections, as the government has begun silencing opposition voices, imprisoning dozens of journalists, filtering the internet, what are we doing? I mean, I know what Congress is doing, and we took another step forward with legislation that we sent on from our committee this morning. But what's the U.S. doing to raise awareness about the human rights violations in Iran? What more can we be doing?
Thank you, Congressman. We are, to answer your first question, we are very concerned about the fact that the Guardian Council, which is not accountable to the Iranian people, is the one that disqualified hundreds of candidates, and we're the ones who selected the 8 candidates for the next election who appear to be, they disqualified others based on very vague criteria, and they selected those who seem most possible to represent the interests of the Guardian Council. We use our assistance in part to work with, for example, internet companies to help Iranian citizens circumvent the restrictions that the Iranian government puts on internet access, so that Iranian citizens are able to have access to information about what's going on in Iran, about the Supreme Council and this questionable selection process, and of course about the candidates that are being put before them. Congressman, I can't answer the question as to what could happen in terms of opposition or demonstrations by reformers against what has happened. Those demonstrations haven't happened yet. But we use the assistance as best we can to shore up the ability of Iranian civil society to understand what they're up against, to communicate with each other, communicate with the outside world, and to increase the space in which they have to operate, to try to establish, to try to bring about some of the democratic institutions, or at least the basis for democratic institutions that they all strive for. In terms of what the United States is doing to highlight human rights abuses, there is no question that Iran is a flagrant human rights abuser. There are significant abuses that they take out against their own citizens, that they undertake elsewhere in the world. We are particularly concerned about the export of Iranian extremism in all forms throughout the Middle East, which we can talk about separately. But we waste no time to point out in public what the Iranians are undertaking in terms of human rights abuses.
Thank you. I appreciate it, and it looks like I may have a little more time, so I'll yield back for now. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. And just to alert members, we will probably have a second round of questions, so if you can't get to what you want to now, we'll get to you on the next. At this time, the chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Weber.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question really has to do with the Camp Liberty residents, and I'll let either one of y'all want to take it up if you would. The state is requesting $22.5 million in economic support for Iraq instead of handing out American tax dollars unconditionally. Why doesn't the administration use that money to either, as leverage, I guess, to urge the Iraqi government to better secure the Camp Liberty residents or move them?
Thank you very much for that question. We have been working very collaboratively, actually, with Prime Minister Maliki to assure the safety of the residents of Camp Liberty. We are in constant conversation with Prime Minister Maliki and with his administration about increasing security there. But more importantly,
and I'm sorry, Ambassador, how long have they been there in the camp?
They've been there a couple of months.
And are you aware of the number of deaths that have occurred in the camp?
I am aware of the number of deaths.
Would you recount those for us, please?
I don't have the numbers with me, I'm sorry. But what I would like to focus on, if you if you permit me, is how much work we are doing to get to find places for the residents of Camp Liberty to move to, so that they are safe and secure, so that they are out of Iraq, so that they are in places where they can carry on a normal life, which they're not able to do in Camp Liberty in Iraq. The important thing is for the MEK leadership to make sure that their compatriots know about these opportunities. We've spent considerable amount of time, for instance, to open space for residents of Camp Liberty to move to Albania. Very few have been allowed to move, have moved so far. We also
You say they have not been allowed
Correct.
to move? And why is that?
That's unclear, but there is seems.
Isn't that something that we ought to be getting to the bottom of?
Yes, we spend a tremendous amount of time with the leadership of the MEK to help them understand how important it is that they encourage their compatriots to take advantage of these opportunities, and for their own reasons, they are reluctant to promote this in as transparent and aggressive a way as might be appropriate.
Okay. That's all I'm going to ask right now, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. And now I'll yield back to the ranking member who is holding the fort down for his side over here today.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Romanowski, I want to again thank USAID and State for the vital and underappreciated role that is played in providing humanitarian relief to the Syrian people. The U.S. has now contributed $510 million to those suffering from violence in Syria, with assistance that provides water, sanitation, hygiene, food assistance, shelter, health care, and protection services. It's been, I think, a heroic effort, but we know that even this amount of assistance remains woefully insufficient to meet the spiraling needs of a war-ravaged country whose people are killed, injured, and forced to flee their homes on a daily basis. Therefore, with respect to our humanitarian assistance in Syria, can you outline some of the challenges that we're facing and how Congress might help the administration do even more to help address the humanitarian crisis?
Excuse me. Thank you for the question. We would agree with you that the humanitarian situation in Syria is increasing and presents a huge problem for the international community and the support that we all have. We have we are working with the international community to raise additional resources and to bring their resources to bear on the problem. We are working to ensure that the humanitarian assistance that is available, that we can provide, is getting to all the governorates in Syria, as well as also the communities in Lebanon and in Jordan. In fact, I was just in Jordan a few weeks ago, where I did see firsthand the impact that our programs that we're doing in Jordan, such as the water resources, building new schools, and improving hospital facilities, has included a lot of work for the Syrian refugees there. We are as vigilant as we can in tracking the humanitarian assistance and also the humanitarian crisis, and are looking and are constantly engaging with our international donors on how we can best get the assistance in there. There are times where it is difficult to get our assistance in there, but we are doing what we can to make sure that we also don't put our people in harm's way.
I wonder, given the $500 million investment in humanitarian relief aid and the difficulties that you outline and how to provide it, how to ensure the safety of the humanitarian workers, Ambassador Jones, I wonder whether there ought to be a broader discussion about the possible creation of a humanitarian corridor, whether that's something that the United States should, the extent to which the United States should help participate in that, whether it's something that can be done in conjunction with our allies, there are lots of discussions about what we ought to be doing in Syria, but certainly as we talk about the humanitarian needs, it seems that this is something that should at least be a major part of the conversation, and it doesn't seem to be, and I wonder if you can comment.
It's a very good question, Congressman, and it's something that we talk about, especially our humanitarian experts talk about with their colleagues internationally as to how can we enhance, how can we improve our ability to get humanitarian supplies to all the communities in Syria that need them. And as my colleague has outlined, the need is huge. There are a variety of ways that one could go after a humanitarian corridor, as you mentioned it. We certainly have spent quite a bit of time with our own, with the Free Syrian Army commanders that we know well, other members of the Syrian Opposition Coalition, to talk about how they might facilitate the travel and the transportation of humanitarian supplies through Syria. And that's one of the reasons that we've provided, and we hope to provide communications equipment to them so that they can communicate along the way through the various armed groups that form the Free Syrian Army so that these supplies can get through. We have had conversations internationally, including with our Russian colleagues, to see if there isn't a way that they can help us enhance the ability of humanitarian organizations to get food and medical supplies through. But I think what you're talking about,
if I could, and I'm out of time, but if I could just make this observation, I understand that it's difficult. That there are very serious decisions that have to be made about what to do in Syria. I understand the role that Russia plays in this. There are a lot of moving pieces, but it certainly seems that with respect to the humanitarian part of this crisis, the humanitarian part of this crisis that is caused by the ongoing slaughter of the Syrian people by Assad, that certainly even those nations with which we deal who have closer relationships with Assad would acknowledge that it is in our collective best interest to take some sort of action to at least stop or at least slow the bloodshed. I would just leave that on the table and yield back the rest of my time.
And gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Yoho.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador Jones and Ms. Romanowski, I appreciate you being here. If you could, help me think outside of the box here, because every time I've come to one of these meetings and over the course of my adult life, I hear that we need to throw more money into the Middle East, we need to bring security, we need to help on human rights violations, abuse to women, religious persecution, lack of property rights, corrupt, repressive governments. And we've thrown money year after year. And in this state and time in our economy, when we're borrowing 43 cents on every dollar to send it over there without doing something different would be absolutely ludicrous, I feel. And if you can come up with a better way of bringing stability, because the bottom line is no matter how much money you throw there, you're going to have a repressive form of government. And to bring democracy, I understand that, and I understand what you're trying to accomplish. But yet, when you look back when Mubarak stepped into the role of president, people said, after Anwar Sadat got killed and there was that interim in there, they said, who's going to be your next president according to your Constitution? They said, don't worry about our Constitution because none of the Egyptian people understand the Constitution. The person that's going to be the next president is who's ever in charge of the military. So you have a repressive government going to a repressive government, and as my colleague down here, Mr. Collins, said, you see more persecution or more arrests under President Morsi. So what can we do different than money at this point in time in our country? And I'd like to hear both of your thoughts on that. Thank you.
You asked for what we're doing differently. What are the ideas that we have that are not the same old ideas? And I appreciate that very much. The situation, of course, that we have is quite different than the one we had even 2 years ago because of the Arab Spring. We are dealing with—
I'm going to interrupt you there. I agree it is right now, but if you look at over the course of the last 30 years, there's been several times just like now, and if you go back over the course of the last 2,000 years, there's been the times that we have right now. And so I agree it is different right now, but it's not that much different than we've seen over the past 2,000 years.
But we have tools that are quite different now, and we have practices that are quite different now than they were, I don't know about 2,000 years ago, but than they were in the past. And they work in the following ways. We have two kinds of funds that we use now. And we're just asking for $580 million for the Middle East North Africa Incentive Fund as a new tool, as a new way to deal with the challenges that we find in the Arab Spring countries, in these new democracies. This fund allows us the flexibility to work with these new governments as they see the opportunities, as they focus on the areas that they are able to focus on, to develop the democratic institutions that they need. So this is particularly important in Tunisia, for instance. It's particularly important even in Libya, but certainly also in Egypt, Yemen, and we will be using it, I hope, someday in Syria. This is to incentivize governments to work on the kinds of things that they need to develop democratic institutions, whether it's rule of law issues, whether it's how to hold an election, another election that's free and fair, whether it's on things like weapons abatement. Because one of the big challenges that we see right now with the Arab Spring is as these governments are learning and their populations are learning the ropes of developing democratic institutions, they're confronted with huge security challenges that require a lot of immediate help, and that we can do through the Mean Incentive Fund as well. So even though we have programs that we use in these countries to work with civil society, we want to be able to do both. We want to have the flexibility to work with civil society as there are challenges that we develop, whether it's on economic reforms, security reforms, political reforms, but also this Mean Incentive Fund allows us to work with governments as they struggle to figure out how to make this democracy that they have in their hands, how to make it work.
Thank you. I'm going to ask Ms. Romanowski to add in there. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman. I think we do have a number of tools that we have actually brought in the last couple of years to find a different way to engage the Egyptian people and the process that they're going on in this transition. I just want to point to a few. The first one I would say is, again, we have focused a lot more of our support directly to civil society organizations and to bring the technical expertise that they need to build up their ability to advocate for their interests, to understand what it is like to have civil organizations that advocate and that work closely with government institutions or within their own societies to promote what their interests are and to collect their interest. I want to point to the fact that we have shifted a lot of our, and are continuing to look for ways that we draw in more the private sector, both the international private sector, the Egyptian private sector, in focusing on investing in their own country. I would say that the U.S.-Egyptian Enterprise Fund has been a very successful and very new approach to attracting the private sector and focusing on building up small and medium enterprises. And finally, I just want to point out to the fact that we are looking at launching this U.S. higher education initiative, which is directly focused on Egyptian young people and giving them the skills through scholarships. We're looking at a very large investment in building university partnerships to help in changing the way Egyptians learn, how institutions teach them, and bring actually the private sector into this process, as this has been successful in our own country as we were looking at how do we generate jobs for our own. So we are bringing a lot of lessons learned into the new toolkit that we have to engage with the Egyptian people.
All right, thank you. The gentleman's time has expired.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Conley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The idea that not much has changed in 2,000 years in this region, I can't quite let go by, Ambassador Jones. How about a little history lesson between us here? Was Islam around 2,000 years ago?
No.
Was Christianity around 2,000 years ago? Was the region we know as the Middle East governed by one unity at the time?
Certainly not.
Roman Empire, however, had a footprint in the region, we would agree. Correct?
Correct.
So the forces at work in the Middle East 2,000 years ago actually are pretty fundamentally different than the forces at work today. Might one conclude that?
Yes.
Huh. Now, the other interesting thing I just heard from our colleague was, can't we do something other than money? Shouldn't we do something other than money? The Camp David Accord, correct me if I'm wrong, another little piece of history here, was the first formal accord since Israel's independence between an Arab belligerent state and the State of Israel, sealing a peace accord formally. Is that correct?
Absolutely.
Now, the United States was the convener of the Camp David Accord. That's why it was named after Camp David, which is in Maryland. Is that not correct?
Absolutely.
And did we not agree to help finance some of the positive attributes that flowed from Camp David, and did we not consider it cheap at the price, that is, the price of peace?
It is absolutely cheap.
And would it be fair, do you think, to say, you can chime in here, Ms. Romanowski, that whatever the cash flows to both Israel and Egypt pursuant to the Camp David Accords have in fact proved their worth? That is to say, it's been an enduring peace.
That's exactly right.
And prior to Camp David, they were in a state of certainly readiness for war and had just completed a fairly brutal war in 1973. Is that fair?
1973, that's right.
And Ms. Romanowski, have we just wasted all this cash that your agency has been, just pouring out on Egypt and Israel pursuant to the Camp David Accords?
Congressman, I don't believe we have wasted a dime.
Well, has it had dividends?
I believe it has had dividends. We have seen an emerging Egyptian civil society. We've seen Egyptian people look to demand more from their government and to demand a stronger economy.
Well, what about Israel?
And Israel is living in peace side by side with Egypt.
And the economic aid we provided Israel maybe had something to do with Israel's current economic success? Do we take any claim for that at all?
We do, absolutely.
Your mic's not on, Ambassador Jones.
We do take credit for that, yes.
And in fact, so much so that they've actually sort of graduated in terms of economic development assistance and economic support funds. Is that correct? Yeah. So other than that, I'm sure cash has no value. But in the ensuing years since 1978, 1979, it seems one could observe that these are investments that have helped provide stability in a region not always known for it, and that took a major belligerent off the table, giving us some breathing space to try to build on that set of peace accords. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but an observer might conclude that from our foreign assistance posture in the region.
That's exactly right.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Cotton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Jones, thank you for your time and for your service to our country. 35 years as a Foreign Service officer, is that correct?
That's right.
Did we make Foreign Service officers at age 7?
Thank you.
When was the last time you testified before a committee of Congress?
I testified on Syria probably about a month ago.
On the Senate Foreign Relations Committee?
Correct.
Good. There's a few things that have come to light since then about the Benghazi attacks that I'd like to discuss with you. According to an email that you sent on September 12th, you had seen the Libyan ambassador to the United States that day, and he said he believed the attacks had been conducted by sympathizers to the former Gaddafi regime, and that you corrected him that those attacks were conducted by Ansar al-Sharia, a group affiliated with Islamic terrorists. How did you know that on September 12th?
What actually happened, Congressman, is that there were stories coming out of the Libyan press that quoted Libyan officials as saying that it could have been old adherents of Gaddafi who had conducted the attack in Benghazi. And I had a conversation with Ambassador Ros-Lehtinen to say that I had seen on the websites that Ansar al-Sharia had claimed responsibility, that it didn't seem to me that it was necessarily the adherents of Gaddafi. And that it would be important to have an investigation to ensure that we knew what had happened. The reason I had that conversation with him and reported it to my colleagues in Tripoli was that I wanted to start the conversation about how important it was to be sure that we were working on counter-terrorist, counter-extremist activities in Libya, so that the kind of cooperation that we needed to have in Libya and across North Africa and elsewhere in the Middle East would be forthcoming.
Yes, which unfortunately we did not receive, given the hostility of the Libyan government after we blamed it on an unruly mob. I'd like to
no,
move.
that is not correct.
Oh, would you like to say what is correct?
What is correct is the Libyan government.
Did the Libyan government provide us access to the scene of the attacks in the immediate aftermath? There was no delay. There was no effort to preclude our investigators or American officials from receiving access to those scenes.
Let me tell the story. The Libyan government was extremely upset by what had happened in Benghazi, and they offered all possible assistance, condolences, and support for the United States in pursuing the investigation. They gave access to the FBI as soon as the FBI wished to arrive in Tripoli, and they gave full cooperation to the FBI and to the investigators to the best of their ability. When the FBI asked for access, they got access.
Okay. Obviously, we all know about a series of email exchanges on September 14th and 15th about the talking points that originated at the CIA and then went to the State Department and White House and finally the Deputies Committee. On those exchanges, many of which are redacted but have their office designation, for example, Office of Congressional Affairs or Office of Legislative Affairs at the CIA, I saw the names Toria Newland, David Adams, Jacob Sullivan. I don't recall seeing your name on those email exchanges. Do you recall being on those exchanges of the approximately 100 pages that were released a couple weeks ago?
Congressman, I was intensely busy working with my embassies in the Middle East, 20 of which were we had 20 posts that had demonstrations that weekend from across that period of time. I was not involved in any of the talking points issues. And so my name wasn't on those emails.
I understand. I just wanted to make sure that you were not on them. I didn't want to misunderstand. Toria Newland, we all know, is a spokesman. Who is David Adams?
It might be appropriate to discuss all of this in another setting. I'd rather talk about the budget request.
Well, part of the budget request goes to the confidence we have in the senior leadership of the State Department. So I would like an answer to my question, please. Who is David Adams?
David Adams is no longer at the State Department.
Who was he at the time, though?
He was the Assistant Secretary for Congressional Relations.
Jacob Sullivan?
He worked for, he was the Director of Policy Planning.
But not, so neither one of those were in your Bureau, Near East Affairs, correct?
I beg your pardon?
Neither in Near East Affairs or had any particular expertise in Near East Affairs?
I don't understand your question.
Neither of those officials, David Adams or Jacob Sullivan, were part of the Near East Affairs Bureau at the State Department.
No.
I see my time has expired for now.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes the ranking member.
I thank the chairman. Well, I mean, with all due respect to my friend from Arkansas, I'm not sure this hearing is the time or place to continue to rehash Benghazi, but because he's brought it up, I thought I'd respond. The fact is that, as we all know, 4 brave Americans are dead. It's a tragedy, and if we care about the legacy of the loss of those Americans, then I think it's imperative that we move forward on enacting the recommendations of the bipartisan ARB instead of obsessing over who changed which version of talking points and a cover-up that never happened and is simply not backed up by the facts. Truth is, the obsession with Benghazi is about politics. I don't think it's more than that. And I hope my colleagues will join me in a bipartisan manner to help us move forward in protecting the thousands of American diplomats serving around the world. The fact is, to the extent that this is relevant in a budget hearing at all, I think probably what is relevant is the fact that the sequester that we're now living under puts our men and women serving around the world at greater risk by cutting the diplomatic security programs by over $75 million. The budget that was passed by the House would gut the State Department and other agencies by 13%. And the truth is that we have real and serious challenges in the Middle East. There's no question. We've had a chance to talk about some of them. There are tens of thousands of Syrians dying or who have been killed. There are nearly 2 million, or in excess of 2 million refugees. Egypt is on the verge of economic collapse. Iran is preparing for what appear to be fraudulent elections and continuing their drive for nuclear weapons. Libya struggles to put the pieces back together after its revolution, and sectarian violence in Iraq has killed hundreds, even as rockets continue to fly, launched by Hamas. To put so much of the emphasis of our focus on foreign policy on Benghazi still, despite the bipartisan committee that made recommendations that have been and are being implemented, and to ignore pressing international security issues in order to continue what oftentimes, and I do not accuse my friend from Arkansas of this today, but oftentimes in other settings by other members are really little more than furthering political attacks, does, I believe, a disservice to the American people that we represent, and, quite frankly, to our friends and allies around the world. And I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. I think before I recognize myself for questions, I will say this, and with due respect to the ranking member, I do believe it has been brought up. The Benghazi is an issue, and it is an issue that deserves questions. It goes, as the gentleman from Arkansas said, it goes to a trust issue. It goes to a trust factor of how we view this. And I think inside a budget context, there is a budget context because the State Department actually said that security purposes were not hindered because of budget reasons. There was a lot of other issues here. As we deal with this and we move forward, and we will deal with this in other ways, I think those records are straight, and I think getting back to the very fact of this is not political, there's 4 dead Americans, and those are questions that need to be asked. But getting back to other questions and that we have here for this day, I want to switch our attention to a different level, and it says, given the, basically with the MENA IF, the funds and the breadth of authority sought for this, it would appear that this initiative is no different, in all fairness, from a slush fund. What office within the department will provide oversight for the expenditures of these funds?
Thank you for that question. The MENA Incentive Fund will be supervised by my office and by AID. What we're looking for is applications from governments for particular programs that they wish to pursue, and those programs will be evaluated and funded based on a set of criteria that will be transparent and determined by people who are expert in assistance, in these kinds of assistance programs.
Okay, I understand. Is it state or USAID? Which one's going to decide where the money, who has final authority? Who's going to say where the money goes? I like that. They both look at each other and say, not me, not you. No, which one?
Well, we look at each other because we collaborate on all of these things, but we have the final decision at the State Department, yes.
State has final decision, right. Okay. This is something that has, in me, I bring a newness to this because, dealing with this, I'm used to dealing with concrete kind of things. When we're dealing with this issue and that your department's going to be overseeing, how will you inform Congress of funding decisions, implementation progress, or benchmarks, but also have there been written guidelines to say, here's what we're going to use, here are the benchmarks we're going to use, in determining how this is made? Has that actually been written down, or is it just seeming we're just going to have oversight?
I believe that they have been, but that's something that I'd like to get back to you on, because I know there's been a tremendous amount of work and a tremendous number of briefings that have been provided to Congress about exactly how this MENA incentive fund is meant to work. But maybe I could just explain one aspect of it. One of the things we found during the Arab Spring is that we had immediate needs to support civil society and to support these emerging governments in the economic reforms and democratic reforms that they needed to undertake, and we were having to pull money from here, there, and the other place. A lesson learned from that was to establish a fund that provided us, that was in one place, that provided us the flexibility that we needed, so that we knew we had some of that kind of funding to do the immediate work that would be necessary as these governments develop their needs.
Well, Ambassador, I appreciate that, and I think really from a bipartisan perspective here, there's a concern as you look over this, and what we seem to have, and I've made this statement before, is that when something goes wrong, it's always, well, if we had had oversight, or if we'd have done better, we would have found the problem. Well, here's the starting point right now. I'm asking, and using these, and you said it, new governments emerging in the transitional. Why don't we have something now that sort of gives a little more structural guidance to this, instead of saying, well, we just sort of have to wing it?
Congressman, we do have programs, Mr. Chairman. We do have programs that Ileana Romanowski can speak in greater detail about, that addresses addresses a great number of the issues that we know now that we need to address, whether it's economic reform issues, weapons abatement, et cetera. But there may be, for instance, we didn't know a year ago that we were going to have to do so much work on the NGO law in Egypt. We have been able to bring experts to work with the Egyptians to explain to them what the international standard is for an NGO law. That's something that we didn't anticipate, but we have had the funding. We would like to have the funding in order to be able to do. The same thing with the Tunisian constitution. We didn't anticipate the needs that the Tunisians may have had on drafting the Constitution, and so we wanted to be able to provide the technical expertise to help them with that.
And what is, besides a hearing like this, is there been developed processes to inform Congress that these benchmarks are being made, these are what we determine? What is the process right now for informing Congress in an oversight role of this issue?
We have, my colleagues who work on the incentive fund are up in Congress all the time discussing elements of the incentive fund, and are briefing all the time on what it would do if it were funded.
Okay, can you be specific in that? Because there seems to be an understanding here that that's not taking place. So can you be more specific on how that's actually happening?
Congressman, Mr. Chairman, I don't have the dates that my colleagues have been up briefing on the Hill on this, but it seems to me to be very frequent that they
Can you tell who they came to see?
I'll have to tell you. I don't know the details.
Okay, can we get I would like to know when they came to see, who they came to see, how long their implementation, because there seems to be some concern here that that's not taking place. It may be talking about other issues, but we're not getting, especially when it deals with benchmarks as we go forward here. I think that's the concern I have, and this in looking at it from a perspective of just process here, and not to be, an advocate. This is a working role where we work together at this, providing the process moving forward. So as we do so, we're wanting the same end. We want a peaceful society in which our funds are being used in a way that promotes an outcome that is beneficial, and that's what we're looking for. So at this point in time, I may have other questions, but I'm going to head and recognize the ranking member for any more questions he may have.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador Jones, when Secretary Kerry appeared before our full committee, he said that there was a 1 to 2 year window remaining for a two-state solution to be viable in the Middle East. Is that the official position now, the official U.S. position?
Yes, that's certainly his view. He's the Secretary of State. He articulated that. That makes it the official U.S. position. But it's an estimate on his part, in fairness.
Okay. Switching to Egypt, can you talk about the current status of the financial crisis in Egypt, the declining foreign currency reserves? What does that mean for Egypt's economic stability, the prospects for this IMF loan package to go through, how the recent cabinet reshuffle ultimately is going to influence Egypt's chances, and given the polarization that's present, how will Egypt be able to make take the kind of action, make the kind of economic reforms necessary that will permit that IMF loan package to ever go forward?
That's a very important issue for the United States. It's important to the United States to have an economically stable Egypt. We have advocated to the Egyptians in great detail the importance of their concluding the deal with the IMF for this loan and to undertake the reforms, the economic and structural reforms that are necessary for the IMF to close the deal. We've explained in some detail why this is important over the long term to the Egyptians. And we've advocated to them that by concluding this agreement with the IMF, they unlock assistance from other funding organizations. They create greater confidence in Egypt's financial future, in Egypt's economic future, its trade future, and it makes Egypt that much more interesting for foreign direct investment, which after all is key to developing jobs, key to Egypt's future security and prosperity. I can't tell you when Egypt is going to conclude the agreement with the IMF. We press very hard for them to do that. I don't know what the cabinet change means for this, but we don't waste time explaining as much as we possibly, advocating as strongly as we can to the Egyptians the importance of their concluding this agreement.
I mean, do you, when you express that to the Egyptians, do you believe that we're going to be able to get from where we are now to the closure of this loan transaction? Will there be the reforms? Is it your sense that there is in weighing the options, that it's clear to the Egyptians that the reforms that are being required by the IMF and moving forward on those reforms is paramount to getting this done, and that ultimately, if they don't get this done, it raises the real possibility that it's not just that the IMF loan won't go forward, but that the existence of the government will be called into question?
It's a very difficult issue for the Morsi government. There's no question about it. They certainly see that there are political implications of pursuing the reforms because every IMF reform is difficult politically. But at the same time, as we advocate to the government that they need to make these reforms, we advocate also to the opposition that they should support the government in making these reforms, that no matter, that even though it's politically difficult and the government will, as governments do, pay a political price to some extent for making these reforms, that the Egyptian opposition should not take advantage of that because it is so much in the long-term interest of Egypt to be economically stable, and that's just as much in the interest of the opposition as it is of the government.
Right, and that's an interesting and important point. And do you think that the opposition understands that and agrees, or will it be too easy to seize upon the political opportunity?
The opposition understands it and agrees. Whether that will translate into their making the kinds of public statements that would be necessary to support President Morsi is a different question. I don't know the answer.
I appreciate that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And before I recognize the gentleman from Arkansas, I'd like just to make there was a general brief given after the budget came out. What we're looking for is a specific briefing on this fund, dealing with the very issues that I was talking about, the benchmarks, how we're determined. So that was what I was referencing and want to be clear on, and we can talk about that in a minute. At this point, I'll recognize the gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Cotton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've had a very happy working relationship with my friend from Florida earlier throughout the Congress, and his comments earlier today doesn't make any kind of impact on that. I do think that it's important, though, to explore Benghazi, both what happened beforehand, so as he said, we won't have it happen again, what happened during, and why exactly those 4 Americans died, and what's happened since then. And the ambassador has a distinguished 35-year career. She served in not only the Obama administration, but the Bush administration, the second Bush administration, the Clinton administration, in high-level positions. We've already learned 2 important facts. One, where she received those reports on the September 12th email that Mr. Gowdy had read into the record at another committee, and also the fact that she was not involved in the talking points email traffic that went back and forth on September 14th and 15th. There are matters that have come to light since she last testified before the Congress in April, and I think it's important that she be able to address those. The next one I would like to raise is the testimony of Gregory Hicks a couple weeks ago. He said that he was very surprised by Susan Rice's statements on the Sunday morning news shows on September 16th, and that he spoke to you about it, and that you made it clear to him that you didn't want to discuss it and you did not want to pursue it. Would you care to respond to that, Ms. Ambassador?
Yes. As I mentioned earlier, I spent that week and the weekend focused on the many other months of my posts in the NEA region where there were demonstrations, where there was serious damage to our embassies, where some of our people were in danger. We had undertaken evacuations. I was working on all of that. I spoke to Greg Hicks many, many, many times every day and many times every evening. I spoke to him that Monday morning after the talk shows. He asked me about it. I said I didn't know. But there was no implication whatsoever that I was cutting off the conversation. None.
Thank you. He also said in that testimony that you, quote, counseled, end quote, him. He said that it was about, quote, his management style, end quote, and he characterized the counseling as, quote, blistering, end quote. Would you care to respond?
I just as soon not discuss those kinds of personnel matters in a public hearing.
Did you make the decision to counsel whatever the content of the counseling, Mr. Hicks, on your own, or did you receive direction from more senior officers in the State Department to counsel him?
That was a decision I made.
Did Cheryl Mills direct you to counsel him at any point?
That was a decision I made.
Okay. Raymond Maxwell, the Deputy Assistant Secretary, would that be your chief deputy?
He's not my chief deputy. He was one of my deputies.
How many deputies do you have?
6.
Okay. Is he still on administrative leave to this day?
That's my understanding, yes.
Okay. And were you the officer that informed him that he would be placed on administrative leave?
I was not. However, that is also an administrative personnel matter that is not within my purview, and it's not appropriate for me to discuss it.
It's been reported by Josh Rogan in the Daily Beast that this was a decision made by Cheryl Mills, and you were under the understanding when she made that decision that Mr. Maxwell would be reassigned, not placed on administrative leave. Is that correct?
That's a personnel matter that I just assume not discuss on an open hearing.
Thank you. I yield back the balance of my time. Thank the gentleman. At this time, I know there will be other questions, and I know we'll be submitting. I do want to thank the ambassador and Ms. Romanowski for being here today. This is a very important hearing because it is really the flashpoint for many things we see in the paper. This is one of the areas I know from my constituency and others on both sides of the aisle's constituency they're concerned about because it is something they see played out in the news media all the time. You being here answering these questions as we go through this budget, I think there's a responsibility had by all of us to make sure not only is our money well spent, but it is also have a programmatic understanding of this is the oversight role, this is the place that we need to have these questions. These are the places that we need to make sure that we're doing what the American people sent us here to do. I appreciate your service. I appreciate your time being here. And with no others, then this committee meeting is adjourned.